Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a story that's strange, gentle, and almost unbelievable. Imagine this: a silent palace at night, candlelight flickering across cold marble floors, and down a long, endless hallway, a woman walks, her silk gown billowing and heavy as though she's carrying the weight of an entire dynasty on her shoulders. Every step she takes is watched, every gesture, every smile, meticulously practiced. But there's one thing no one ever says out loud. Beneath the lace and velvet lies a secret that no one is allowed to speak of. Something deeply real, deeply feminine, yet treated as shameful if revealed. It's menstruation, a natural cycle that was once weaponized by royal courts as political ammunition. Tonight, you'll hear a startling truth about how queens and princesses in feudal times were forced to deal with their own bodies while still keeping that perfect smile through hours-long banquets. Squeezed into corsets, and forbidden from leaving their seat for even a moment. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And just imagine right in the middle of a lavish banquet, where crystal chandeliers cast shimmering shadows on the marble floor, a young queen sits frozen. Her back is straight, as if it were forged from steel. Not because she enjoys formality, but because she's afraid to stand up. Even a tiny red stain on her seat could become gossip for weeks. Not because the court lacks entertainment, but because, strangely, her body is no longer her own. Welcome to the 17th and 18th century European royal courts, where a royal woman's menstrual cycle wasn't just a private matter, but an internal bulletin. Documented, analyzed, and sometimes even translated into multiple languages in case foreign diplomats needed to be updated on the state of royal health. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Yet historians have confirmed this through official correspondence between courts and embassies, where a simple phrase like, "Her Majesty is late," could delay a diplomatic agreement indefinitely. And if you think a late period only causes personal worry, try picturing a royal council calling an emergency meeting because the bedsheet looked too clean that morning. That's right. A queen's physical signs could indicate: 1. She's pregnant. Congratulations. 2. She's about to miscarry. Prepare a backup heir. 3. Something's off. Call the doctor. But make sure he's not a spy from the opposition. Now you see nature's delay. Under the palace lights, we could shift the fate of an entire nation. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Because you see, those voluminous gowns you admire in royal portraits, so elegant, so majestic, were also full-on fabric prisons. They were heavy, very heavy, sometimes weighing as much as a 3-year-old child, and you couldn't just pull them aside for a quick check like we might today. There were no high-waisted stretch panties or antibacterial pads. What they had were soft cloths, tied with ribbons around the waist, secured under layers of gown, petticoat, corset, and yet another thick petticoat like a winter blanket. Changing them, you needed at least 2 maids, a private space, and no less than 15 minutes, like unwrapping a present with 10 layers of packaging. Oh, and if you think changing outfits mid-banquet sounds unlikely, you've clearly never sat for 6 hours in a freezing ballroom with a slowly spreading bloodstain on expensive Italian silk. Trust me, even queens have moments when they wish they could vanish. But don't worry, they weren't alone. Every queen had her team of emotional sisters called ladies-in-waiting, not just confidantes, but also the ones responsible for monitoring and reporting on her monthly situation. Sounds like spies? Well, sort of. Because a blood-stained cloth, if it fell into the hands of political enemies, could be read like a prophecy. Oh, her cycle's irregular. She must be infertile. Time to rewrite the succession laws. Modern historians still debate the accuracy of royal medical records from that era. Did royal physicians really sniff menstrual cloths to diagnose illnesses? Some sources swear by it. Others argue it's just historical dramatization. Either way, it does make you feel grateful for today's sanitary pads with wings. Amid all that, many royal courts turn to remedies that, by today's standards, would make your jaw drop. Ever heard of using mercury to stimulate the womb? They did. The result damaged nervous systems, mood swings, and sometimes temporary memory loss. And lead. It wasn't just in makeup, it was sprinkled inside underwear to mask menstrual odors. The result, pale skin nice. But severely damaged reproductive organs, not so nice. And once the blood came out, they thought, let's drain more to balance things out. So blood was also taken from the hands, legs, or nape of the neck. Why? Because women were believed to be prone to blood excess. How do you feel now? Some of those old treatments really make you rethink complaining about taking cough syrup. But what I admire most isn't how they endured all of that. It's how they still sat upright, kept a gentle smile, and walked as if everything was perfect. No one was allowed to know they were in pain. No one could see their exhaustion. And no one was ever permitted to ask, "Are you okay today?" You and I, at the very least, have the right to complain on our period. They didn't. Even a slight furrow of the brow could be interpreted as emotional instability. So next time you glance at a portrait of a queen with a distant gaze and porcelain skin, remember, she might have been suffering from intense menstrual cramps beneath a dress weighing over 10 kilograms, still smiling and bowing to 400 esteemed guests. And if you're lying in bed now, under a light blanket, listening to the soft hum of a fan, somewhere in the shadows of history, there may have been a queen who wished for the same peace and quiet you're enjoying right now, because their lives were never truly their own. You see, every time the queen was late, it wasn't just the maids whispering behind curtains. Letters were being sent all over Europe. In those letters, phrases like, "Her Majesty is indisposed," didn't mean she had the flu, they meant she hadn't had her period. And for diplomats, that was earth-shattering news. The French might speculate, perhaps she's pregnant. The Spanish would murmur, no. Maybe she's infertile now. And the court, an emergency meeting would be held. Late periods, irregular cycles, or severe cramps weren't just personal matters. They were political signals, a top-level bulletin, a barometer for the nation's future, one the woman carrying it was never allowed to comment on. And you know what's strangest of all? Sometimes the queens weren't even the first to know they'd missed their period. That's right, sometimes it was their closest ladies in waiting, the ones who washed their linens, checked their underlayers, dressed them in the morning, who noticed something was off. And instead of being allowed to rest, that queen would be taken immediately for medical examination. Now don't imagine a clean clinic with the smell of antiseptic like today. No, it was usually a damp room, flickering candlelight, and a physician with not-so-clean hands, holding a cloth in one hand and the royal family's hope in the other. Creepy. Right, I know. But don't worry, we're getting to the softer part now. There's one thing that might make you smile in the midst of all this strangeness. It's the way the ladies, duchesses, countesses, and maids connected with one another, beneath all the manners, politics, and formalities. There existed a strange kind of sisterhood. They didn't need to say much. Just a glance, a towel placed a little differently, a dress change taking slightly longer than usual, and they would know, it's that day. And then the whole team would move like a choreographed ballet. One pulled out the silk cloth, another fetched scented water, another guarded the door. No one asked, no one laughed, and most importantly, no one leaked a word. You might not believe it, but one of the most secure places in history for secrets was the royal household. Not because everyone was loyal, but because one wrong detail could lead to death. Not for the rumor spreader, but for the woman being spoken about. Now think for a moment. If you had to hide the fact that you were on your period while wearing a dress as wide as a dinner table and sitting for 6 hours in a hall listening to the king lecture about a peace treaty with Sweden, would you stay calm? Queens had to. And that's why many of them were diagnosed as melancholic, emotionally unstable, or nervously weak. But ask yourself this: if you couldn't rest, couldn't complain, couldn't refuse an internal exam from a doctor you didn't trust, would you feel cheerful? Many modern feminist historians argue that much of what history labeled as hysteria was actually the perfectly normal response of women being treated like reproductive tools. And if you think this only happened in the old days, well, some of the women watching this channel might find it all strangely familiar. I know. You're probably thinking, how did they endure that for an entire lifetime? The answer might surprise you. They didn't endure it alone. Some queens secretly kept journals. Others snuck into the gardens at night just to cry. Some wrote letters to their sisters abroad that began with lines like, "I can't bear being treated like a machine," every month. And there were those who quietly embroidered, repeating patterns onto handkerchiefs, as if to say to the world, "I'm in my red days. But I'm still a queen." You see, this strange story isn't just about blood, dresses, or royal rituals. It's about silence. A silence that lasted for centuries. A silence wrapped in silk, scented with rosewater, and taught to be unspeakable. But tonight, we speak it, softly, bit by bit, in the gentle dark, under the hum of a fan. You're listening to a story that those women were never allowed to tell. Can you hear it? That's history whispering. Quiet, but enough to stir your sleep. You see, if even menstruation became political, imagine how complicated something as simple as using the bathroom would be when wearing a dress as wide as a tea table and nearly 10 kilograms heavy. Sounds funny, it wasn't. It was truly no simple task for a 17th century royal woman to take care of her personal needs. First, the corset. You know, it didn't just cinch the waist. It also compressed the lungs and bladder. So the urge to relieve oneself wasn't always obvious. And by the time they realized it, it was sometimes too late. Next came the layers: underskirt, overskirt, petticoat, dress ties, and corset. You couldn't just pull something down and be done. No, to go, you needed a support team of at least 2 ladies, and a minimum of 10 minutes. In fact, during certaines périodes, noble women didn't wear underpants as we know them today. They wore skirts with a strategic opening between the legs, basically open crotch trousers, so they could sit on a chamber pot without undressing completely. Sounds reasonable, maybe. But now imagine trying to balance on a slick porcelain pot placed in the middle of a grand bedroom while 3 ladies in waiting stand just outside, awaiting instructions. And you thought queens had private bathrooms? No, not exactly. Most royal castles in Europe back then didn't have modern plumbing systems. Instead, they used chamber pots, porcelain basins, usually hidden under the bed or inside a cabinet. After use, the pot was covered and handed to a servant to be emptied. If you've ever seen a beautifully patterned lidded bowl beneath a bed in a museum, yes, that wasn't for tea. And now for a strange fact few people know. Some queens didn't like leaving their rooms too often during the day, especially in winter. So they intentionally drank less water in the afternoon to avoid having to go. The result? Dehydration, dry skin, cracked lips, and guess what they did to soothe their lips? They licked blood. No joke. This habit was recorded in personal letters from several noble women of the time. Another issue was privacy. Unlike you today, who can lock the bathroom door and play soft music, a queen in the past was almost never alone. There was always someone nearby. Sometimes 1 person, sometimes 3, sometimes an entire team. Which meant that going to the bathroom wasn't just a biological need, It was a carefully choreographed performance. A brass basin was placed beside her. Warm, scented towels were heated moments before, and one maid was tasked solely with keeping the room fragrant. Some records mention nobles using rosewater mixed with fragrant ash to deodorize after relieving themselves. Think of it as the aristocratic version of air freshener. Historians still debate whether this was standard across all royal courts or limited to specific countries. Some French records show queens like Marie Antoinette having private lavatories, while in England, queens shared spaces with their maids and physicians, making them, ironically, more susceptible to being medically monitored. And if you're lying there listening to this and thinking, I bet those palaces didn't smell great, then you're absolutely right. Despite the grandeur, many enclosed chambers reportedly reeked of a mix of French perfume, burning wax, and things you probably don't want to imagine before bed. Still, royal women had to walk with poise, heads high, backs straight, and no visible discomfort. Even with cramps, dizziness, or the desperate urge to hold it in, everything had to appear graceful. So, you see, what exhausted these women wasn't just the weight of a crown. It was the fact that they were never allowed to be themselves. They couldn't sit comfortably. They couldn't relieve themselves normally. They couldn't be sick. They couldn't be irritable. They couldn't say, I'm tired. They were the embodiment of the dynasty, the image of the nation, and the loneliest woman in a crowded room. Now just stay there. Close your eyes. Relax your shoulders. And if you feel grateful that today you can use the bathroom in peace, then maybe we've both just understood something deeper about the value of freedom, even the tiniest kind. And if you thought hygiene stopped at chamber pots and linen cloths, brace yourself for the next chapter. Bathing, something that seems simple, but for queens of the 17th and 18th centuries, was a royal event of strategic planning. Just stay still. Don't move too much. I'll tell it gently. Bathing, for you today, I might be a relaxing experience. Hot showers, a drop of lavender oil, and soft piano music in the background. But for a classic queen, bathing didn't happen daily. In fact, some went an entire month without bathing. Not because they were dirty, but because they weren't allowed or advised not to bathe often. According to medical beliefs of the time. You heard that right. Ancient medical theory believed hot water opened the pores, and if the body was exposed to cold air afterward, bad winds would enter and cause illness. So many physicians warned best not to bathe too frequently. So what did they do? To avoid smelling? Here's the strange part. Instead of bathing, noble women would wipe down with warm perfumed alcohol or rosewater, using soft cloths to scrub the body. Some of these mixtures were infused with herbs like lavender, orange peel, rosemary. It sounds luxurious, but imagine wiping yourself down with warm liquor while it's freezing outside. Not exactly spa-like. They also changed their underlayers regularly, not underwear as we know it, but linen garments designed to absorb sweat. And if you're picturing sexy lingerie from that era with lace and silk, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. It was flat fabric, tied with ribbons, no snaps, no stretch, and definitely no elastic. So when did they actually get to bathe? Usually only on special occasions before a wedding, after childbirth, or when ill, and only if a physician gave permission. In those moments, bathing became a royal ritual with attendants preparing the scene, guards standing by, and someone documenting the event. French court records once described a bathing session of Queen Marie Thérèse, wife of Louis XIV, in a massive oak tub lined with linen and filled with warm orange blossom water. Water wasn't poured from a faucet, it was ladled in by hand, using silver pitchers and the temperature was judged by experience. If the maid's hand could tolerate it, then the queen could too. Sounds dreamy. But don't forget, she never bathed alone. There were always at least 3 people in the room, sometimes more, to help wash her hair, scrub her back, hold her dry clothing, and ensure there were no dynastic accidents. One little known fact: hair was a huge deal back then. Washing it rare. They typically dusted it with scented powder to absorb oil, basically a powdered version of dry shampoo. These powders could be made of cornstarch, white clay, or even rice flour. After a few days, the hair would harden into shape, then be piled high, adorned with wigs, feathers, and glitter. And voila, a hairstyle like Marie Antoinette's. Nearly as tall as a birdcage. Washing the hair, yes, but only when it got itchy. And that usually meant every 2 to 3 weeks. Feeling a little squeamish, me too. The first time I read it. But remember, in a world without hot water, body wash, or blow dryers, staying dry was the real survival strategy. Historians still debate how hygienic royal women truly were. Some sources praise their cleanliness compared to commoners. Others argue that the overwhelming perfumes merely masked a less than pleasant reality. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. In any case, you should know cleanliness then and now are 2 very different things. If you can shower daily and spritz deodorant after work, congratulations. You're living in the most advanced era in human history for personal hygiene. And still, royal women were expected to look elegant even when they had just wiped themselves down with warm red wine, had rice powder in their hair, and hadn't washed it for half a month. You see, the more we understand the real lives behind those puffed gowns and gentle smiles, the more we can truly admire them. They weren't just symbols of power. They were women fighting daily battles, not against enemies outside, but limits within, from waist-crushing corsets to the rule of always smelling sweet without access to running water. So tonight, when you step into the bathroom, turn on the warm water and feel the gentle steam rise. Take a second to think of those queens who once wished, just once, to bathe without anyone watching. You're living something miraculous, even if it's just a regular bath. Have you ever wondered how queens of the past maintained skin as white as porcelain, lips as red as roses, and cheeks rosy, like they'd stepped out of a painting? The answer might make your skin crawl, because to achieve that perfect look, they used lead, mercury, animal fat, and even crushed insects. Sounds more like a chemistry lab than a vanity table. Right, but it's true. In the 17th, 18th centuries, European beauty standards were crystal clear. The whiter your skin, the higher your status. White meant not laboring under the sun, aka noble. So queens, princesses, and noble women all competed to cover their faces in a compound known as Venetian ceruse, or, more plainly, white lead cream. This mixture contained lead acetate, dangerous, obviously, but they didn't know that then. They only saw results: smooth skin, flawless pallor, no spots or blemishes. So they applied, every day, layer after layer on the face, the neck, the hands. The result: over time, the skin began to peel, redden, break out. But instead of stopping, they applied more to cover the wounds. And if you think that was warning enough, listen on. To keep the makeup smooth, they used lead powder dusted over the face like baby powder. For blush, they mixed carmine pigment from crushed cochineal beetles, a natural deep red. Lipstick, no Dior or Maybelline back then. Instead, a blend of beeswax, sheep fat, deep red insect dye, and a touch of almond oil. Some formulas even added mercury to improve staying power. Sounds tempting, Doesn't it? Of course. Not everyone approved. Even at the time, some physicians began issuing warnings: darkened skin, hair loss, tremors, irritability, insomnia, all signs of lead poisoning. But who would dare tell the queen that her face was slowly being eaten away? Many modern historians argue that the so-called mental instability recorded in some queens may not have been due to temperament, but from years of absorbing lead and mercury through daily cosmetics. You see, behind a porcelain-perfect face might be a nervous system quietly collapsing. And scent was no exception, because regular bathing wasn't common. Perfume was the ultimate weapon, but not the fruity florals you're used to today. Perfume then was made from musk, ambergris, a secretion from sperm whales, essential oils, tree bark, resin, and sandalwood hand-blended. Intensely aromatic and incredibly long-lasting. It was often sprayed on the innermost layer of clothing to stay fragrant all day. Some even powdered their hair, hid sachets of herbs in their dresses, and soaked their gloves in orange blossom overnight. So when she entered the room, you smelled her before you saw her. But the price wasn't cheap. After a few years, their faces turned gray, peeling, stripped of natural color. Hair fell out in clumps. Some had to wear wigs for life because their poisoned scalps could no longer grow hair. Marie Antoinette, the famously beautiful French queen, was described as porcelain perfect, yet personal letters reveal she often suffered insomnia, headaches, and, at times, used wine laced with opium to cope with the stress. Historians now suspect that her daily cosmetics played a part in her body's rapid decline. Now think, if every morning you had to smear poison on your face just to be told you looked beautiful, could you bear it for royal women of the time? Beauty wasn't a choice. It was an obligation. Because if you weren't beautiful, you didn't properly represent the dynasty. You couldn't hold the king's attention. You wouldn't impress ambassadors. You wouldn't inspire devotion from the people. And if you stopped being beautiful, someone more beautiful would appear. So now, if you're still awake, I want you to do something small. Next time you stand before the mirror and see a pimple or a little scar, smile. Because you don't need to smear on white lead. You don't need to crush beetles into paste. You don't need to hide your real skin just to symbolize someone else's glory. You only need to be you. Unpolished, imperfect, but free. Now imagine a large, sealed room with heavy curtains blocking out every ray of light. The queen lies on a grand bed embroidered with gold thread. Her face is pale, her hair damp with sweat. Her entire body convulses with pain. No anesthesia. No private doctor. No privacy. Outside the birthing chamber, a long line of dukes, marquesses, archbishops, and high-ranking officials wait, not because they care for the mother's health, but because they need to witness whether that child was truly born from royal womb. Sounds outrageous, but it's true. In 17th century France, the queen's birthing chamber had to be open to witnesses at the moment of delivery. The reason: to ensure no child swapping took place. People feared that without witnesses, a different baby could be smuggled in through a side door, a healthy baby boy, replacing a frail baby girl. For instance, you're thinking, this sounds like a movie. But records show that in 1778, when Queen Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first daughter, more than 100 people stood in the room at the moment of birth. 100 people. In the birthing room. No curtain for privacy. And you think this happened only in France? Not at all. In England, Spain, Austria, similar customs existed. Though the level of public access varied, one rule held true. The queen was never allowed to give birth alone. There was always someone watching, always someone writing, always someone whispering. And sadly, if the child didn't cry, there wasn't a moment of silent mourning. Instead, royal lawyers immediately began discussing succession rights. Childbirth, for royal women, was a national duty. Every month without pregnancy meant rising pressure. And when pregnant, every heartbeat, every step, every facial expression was scrutinized. In some cases, queens weren't allowed to choose where they gave birth. They delivered wherever the court deemed suitable, sometimes in a cold room of the Winter Palace, because it was more convenient for the midwives and easier to secure. Feeling a chill? I did too. And do you know what else? Even after the child was born, the inspection didn't end. Witnesses had to see the placenta expelled completely because a rumor once spread that, if not carefully observed, a queen could hide another baby in the womb. Sounds absurd, but as you know, when a throne is threatened, human imagination becomes very creative. And the queen, after giving birth, no rest. No moment to hold her baby. No tears allowed. Instead, someone would arrive to brush her hair, adjust her attire, and prepare her to appear on the palace balcony, to hold the newborn high, as a symbol of life, of succession, and a political victory. Still in pain, still bleeding, still torn, no one asked. And if the baby was a girl, the atmosphere in the court changed instantly. No one said anything, but the looks were different. The silence heavier. Fewer congratulations. And the queen understood she would need to try again. Soon, some queens gave birth 10 to 15 times, hoping for a prince. Many lost children after birth, miscarried, or died of hemorrhage. But no one honored them like soldiers on the battlefield. And so, some modern historians now emphasize, for queens in feudal times, childbirth wasn't the right of motherhood, it was the duty of a subject. You see, beneath the glow of the crown lies blood, sweat, and a quiet kind of loneliness. If you were born today in a warm room, with a loved one holding your hand, soft lights above, and a gentle doctor nearby, know that you are living in an era far more miraculous than any royal court of the past. And if you are a mother, or will be one, I want to whisper this to you. You don't need an audience. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to present your child to the kingdom. You only need to hold your baby, and that is a victory. Because, you know, motherhood for royal women was nothing like how we understand it today. There were no lullabies sung in the dark. No diapers changed at midnight. No, sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing peekaboo. No skin to skin. No feeding on demand. Not even the right to decide. Because a royal child, from the moment it cried its first cry, no longer belonged to the mother. It belonged to the court, to the nation, to the dynasty. You might wonder, so who raised those children? The answer: wet nurses. Immediately after birth, the baby was taken from the mother, who had just endured hours of agony with no pain relief, and handed to another woman. Strong, lactating, and specially chosen to raise infants. This wet nurse wasn't an ordinary servant. She was carefully vetted, sometimes through a selection process akin to a civil service exam. She had to have a respectable background, robust health, no lowly blood, and absolute loyalty. Historians recorded that King Louis XIV of France was entirely raised by his wet nurse, who was later rewarded with great wealth, land, and titles for raising a healthy king. On the other hand, if the child fell ill or died, the first person suspected was the wet nurse. And did you know, some queens were forbidden from breastfeeding their own children? Why? For a strange reason. Breastfeeding made the breasts sag, and a queen had to remain beautiful to maintain her position with the king. Many courts outright banned royal wives from nursing, claiming that her softness and allure were diplomatic assets, not to be compromised by the biology of motherhood. Sounds absurd. I think so too. Beyond the wet nurse, there was a governess, a personal maid, a tutor. Together, they formed a closed system of aristocratic childcare. The child grew up in a separate nursery, often far from the main palace. The birth mother, she might visit weekly or monthly, and when she did, it was by schedule, with escorts, and under protocol. There was no such thing as dropping into play for a bit. Some queens wrote in letters that they felt like an honorary nanny, not a mother. And that's heartbreaking because to them, to hold their child, kiss them, or hear the word mama was a luxury. It is said that Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century, gave birth to 10 children, but she raised almost none of them herself. Her children were brought up by a staff of attendants, tutors, and royal overseers. When one of them died from illness, Catherine was informed through an official letter, not a whisper, and she was only allowed to cry after the memorial ceremony. You can hold your child when you're sad, kiss their forehead as they sleep, and cry freely if you need to. You don't need anyone's permission. That's how you know motherhood doesn't always come with a title. One little known fact, many royal children did not call their biological mother mama. They used Madame, or Your Majesté, or even Ma Reina my Queen for Ma. Distant, almost chilling. Meanwhile, the wet nurse was called Mama naturally, because she was the one who rocked them to sleep, wiped their noses, and kept them from falling. Some modern royal psychologists believe that many emotional disorders in monarchs stemmed from this early emotional rupture. When you grow up in a world where a hug is a privilege, not an instinct, love becomes a performance. And if you're wondering, did these queens feel lonely? The answer is yes. Many letters, diaries, and private notes reveal the sorrow of royal mothers who heard their babies crying in the next room, but weren't allowed to go in and hold them. Some secretly sent dolls to their children. Some kept a lock of hair in a perfumed pouch close to their chest. One queen, Charlotte, wife of King George III of England, once wrote, "I do not raise my children. I merely delegate their care to others." You see, the deeper you go into royal life, the clearer it becomes. They had everything except the right to be real. To be a wife without choosing your husband. To be a mother without raising your child. To be a queen, but never allowed to be fragile. So if you're lying there, listening to the soft breath of your child sleeping in the next room, or remembering the arms of your mother wrapped around you in childhood, know this: you possess something even the most powerful people in history once longed for. A real connection. A real abraço. A love that needs no audience. Welcome to the world of royal love, where hearts were not allowed to speak unless they matched the map of politics. Lie still now. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and imagine yourself sitting in a gilded room, surrounded by maps, profecias, and kings debating whom their sons should marry. You know something, for hundreds of years, royal marriages didn't begin with a chance glance or a trembling touch of the hand. They began with letters exchanged between two courts, letters that said things like, "We agree to marry off our daughter if your kingdom supplies 3 cetro mercenaries, 10 chests of gold, and refrains from invading our northern border for the next 25 years. That was the proposal. Romantic, isn't it? One of the most famous examples is Princess Maria Theresa of Austria, who was promised in marriage at the age of 6 to the French crown prince she had never met. Neither side of the family ever asked her, "Do you like him?" because the answer didn't matter. What mattered was, would this marriage stabilize the France-Austria alliance? Would it prevent a war? Would it help drive a wedge between Britain and Prussia? If the answer was yes, then the wedding would go ahead, even if the bride fainted from crying. Here's something rarely mentioned. Most royal brides never met their groom until the wedding day. Yes, they married someone they had only seen in a painting. Oh, and sometimes that painting had been touched up a bit. Call it an oil-painted filter. The result, many a princess arrived at her new palace full of romantic hopes, only to find a husband shorter than expected, fatter than expected, balder than expected, and colder than a Saint14.com. Petersburg winter. And love it existed, but often one-sided, or worse, present at first, but worn down by duty. Many princesses wrote letters home, saying things like, "He didn't look at me for the first 3 days. He was with another woman on our wedding night. I sleep alone. But at least the statue of the Virgin Mary at my bedside watches over me." You see, she may have been a queen, but not the woman who was loved. And as for royal men, marriage, for them, was also an assignment. And they were allowed to have mistresses, not out of love, but because politics got involved again. Having someone on the side allowed them to express emotion without relying on a wife they never chose. Sometimes, the official mistress even held her own place in society, like Madame de Pompadour in France, who was not only a royal lover, but also a strategic advisor and patron of the arts. Meanwhile, the king's wife, the queen, had only one duty: to bear a son. Don't you feel like something's off? You're not alone. Even queens felt the same. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, once said, "If love is a luxury, then at least let me choose who will kill me." Because in the end, she was beheaded for not producing a son. A love hanging on the blade of politics cannot blossom. And yet, amid those arranged marriages, there were strange moments. Some women learned to love their husbands, some poured all their love into their children, and some found quiet joy in embroidery, in reading, or teaching a young princess to read. They didn't have fiery passion, but they had something more precious: the resilience of the heart. Because even without being loved, they tried to be kind. Even without being chosen, they chose to be compassionate. So, if you live in a time where you can choose whom to love, if you can turn down a proposal that doesn't feel right, if you can love someone for their smile, not the land they govern, then you are living the very miracle that princesses of the past once longed for with graying hair. Royal mistress, a title that sounds both shadowy and glittering. Not a wife, but not a servant. No title, but full of influence. No crown, but sometimes one whisper from her could shift a nation's allegiance in war. Just imagine a vast palace, amber lantern light, casting shadows on marble floors. The king is feasting with his ministers. Meanwhile, in the next room, a woman waits. No title, no ceremonial hymns, no applause. And yet, every word the king speaks tonight was shaped by her whispers the night before. That woman is the official mistress, a real role, officially acknowledged, and sometimes more powerful than the queen. One of the most iconic names in history, Madame de Pompadour, famed mistress of King Louis XV. She wasn't just a lover. She was an advisor, un patron, a political broker, and someone who read men like books. Pompadour didn't bear the king's children, didn't become queen, never sat on the throne, but she chose another path to wield power through intellect, not lineage. Every whisper from her shaped France's treasury. Every afternoon tea with the king decided a minister's fate, and every furrow of her brow could unseat a noble from the royal council. You might ask, why did the king listen to his mistress more than his wife? The answer lies in something simple. The mistress had no obligation, no ceremony, no royal responsibility. She came to the king not for politics, but because she made him feel like himself. The queen had to uphold the image. The mistress was allowed to laugh, tease, and be jealous. A historian once wrote, "If the queen is the kingdom's lawful wife, the mistress is the lawful wife of the king's heart." Bittersweet, isn't it? But you see, in a world where marriage was a treaty, the one who brought true feeling was often the one standing outside the door. Not just in France. In England, Barbara Palmer, the mistress of King Charles II, once had the entire court in turmoil. When she raised an eyebrow, the king changed laws. When she was angry, the king's favorite minister was exiled. And when she whispered, "I like that house," 3 days later it was hers. And you know what's the strangest part? Both the queen and the court had to accept it, because the king loved her. And that was enough. But not all royal mistresses held power. Some were loved briefly, then sent to convents, or hastily married off to distant nobles to preserve the dignity of the court. Some became pregnant, but their children were never acknowledged. Their love was a double-edged sword. On one side, the sweet taste of power. On the other, the price of invisibility. Few know this, but royal mistresses often had to outshine the queen. They weren't allowed to be wrong, not allowed to age, not allowed to be jealous, not allowed to be weak. A single mistake, one slip of the tongue, or even a pimple could cost them everything. So they learned to smile at the right moment, stay silent when needed, and memorize every noble's name at banquets to never greet the wrong person. These weren't the skills of a lover. They were the skills of a crownless politician. So don't be too quick to think of a royal mistress as the lucky other woman. Behind every seductive smile was a heart constantly afraid of being replaced. Behind every silk dress were sleepless nights, listening for signs the king had grown cold. And behind every fleeting affair was a woman whose name history never recorded, even though she once held the fate of a kingdom in her hands. You're listening to this in silence. But in history, these were whispers that shook thrones, because sometimes the greatest power wasn't on the throne, but in a small armchair, where a woman sat, poured tea, and softly asked, "What are you planning to do next?" Picture this. A queen once hailed as the epitome of beauty, once the king's obsession, once adored by earls, once praised by the people like a goddess descended. But time passed. The king loved someone new. Alliances shifted, and suddenly, her presence became inconvenient. No one said it out loud, but visits grew fewer. Banquet invitations stopped arriving. Greetings in the hallway became cold nods. And her chambers, once the center of light, were quietly relocated to the dim corridor. There was no official exile, but everyone understood she had been removed from the stage. There were queens who, once they could no longer bear children, were quietly sent to convents, a form of silent retirement. There, they no longer had to worry about state affairs, but they were also not allowed to return to ordinary life. Like a statue removed from the square, no one destroyed it. But no one looked up at it anymore. Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I of England, was once one of the most powerful women in Europe. She loved the arts, patronized literature, and was admired for her sharp intellect. But when her health declined, she was isolated in a private room and died alone without the king at her side. After her death, her funeral was delayed, then shortened. No grand monument, no national day of mourning. Just one brief line in the records: the queen has passed. Another name, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, a woman of legendary beauty, but one who never felt she belonged on the throne. She hated ceremony. We feared the palace, and once wrote, "I am a canary trapped in a gilded cage." Everyone loves my song. But no one asks if I want to sing. In her final years, she wandered across Europe, dressed in black, in disguise, with no entourage. And when she was assassinated in Geneva, many didn't recognize her as a queen until the autopsy. A royal life, but a death like a stranger. History has not been kinder to queens who failed. Marie Antoinette, once led to the guillotine, was no longer a fashion icon, but a subject of mockery. She was portrayed as indulgent, heartless, even though she had stayed up many nights worrying over her children. Her handwritten letters, her blood-stained prayers from prison, were ignored. Only one sentence remained, a sentence she never even said: if they have no bread, let them eat cake. You see, death doesn't just steal life. It also steals the true story. And strangely, queens are often buried in beautiful places. Grand cathedrals, marble tombs, next to their kings. But the bitter truth is in death. They are finally close to the man they waited for their whole lives. In life, they slept in separate chambers, saw each other during ceremonies, spoke through secretaries, and were addressed by title, not by name. So when you see those magnificent tombs, remember, not all greatness comes with happiness. Some crowns are heavy, not because they're made of gold, but because the one who wore them had to be silent, had to endure, had to carry it with composure. And when they fell, no one spoke their name. Are you still awake? If you are, I want you to know that there were women in history, queens, who spent their entire lives wishing for one simple thing: to be remembered, not as someone's wife, but as themselves. And tonight, you've done just that. You've listened. You've felt. You've remembered them. In your quiet room, with your steady breath and the soft hum of the fan, you've just brought back to life those women forgotten by history. And now, as the story comes to a close, let your eyes gently close too, your breath steady, your heart light. The whispers of queens long gone, women who once lived in silk but died in silence, are fading into the dark. But you know what? Even if they're gone, even if their names have gathered dust through time, as long as someone remembers, as long as someone listens, they have never truly disappeared. And you tonight are the one holding that little candle. In your quiet room, in a world that has forgotten how to listen. So thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for letting me tell the story. Now, let your shoulders soften. Let every thought drift, and allow sleep to come gently like a soft blanket over your heart. Good night. We'll meet again in another story, on another quiet night.